Hello? May I have your attention? We are about to start. Good morning, ladies. Welcome to our November general meeting. I'm Farzana Seddon, President of KCWC. Thank you for braving the rain and being here with us today. This is our first general meeting at Royal Overseas League, and I hope you will agree that this is a truly splendid venue, and we plan to return here for our next two general meetings before we return to the Royal Geographical Society in May next year. We have a remarkable speaker today with us, and without further ado, I would like to invite Vivian Matthews to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
May I just also welcome you all, and just make sure that you can actually hear quite well with these microphones. Good, okay, that's great. I think that's important for us to know. I'd just like to introduce myself. I think many people do know I'm Vivian Matthews, and involved with the programs and also the marketing promotions of the club, KCWC. And I am very delighted today to be able to introduce our wonderful speaker, Emma Soames. So we're really delighted, Emma, that you're with us today and able to talk to all the KCWC members who've been looking forward to this special occasion. I'd like to introduce Emma, who is a very distinguished writer, broadcaster, and columnist who has been the editor of a number of publications, including the Literary Review, Tatler magazine, ES magazine, the Telegraph magazine, and also Saga magazine. And we originally first met, actually, when Emma Soames was editor of the Tatler magazine, and I was starting at Condé Nast as well. Just to say a little bit about Emma, and also about her absolutely wonderful book on her mother's wartime diaries. But just to say that Emma is, as so many will know, the daughter of Mary and Christopher Soames, and Emma's also her mother's literary executive, hence her work on this wonderful book and bringing it to be published as the editor. Emma is also, as we know, the granddaughter of Winston and Clementine Churchill. I just want to say a few points about the book, because I know that Emma will be a little bit modest about some aspects of sort of the family history in a sense. So I thought it would be wonderful just to say a few tiny little points, and just to say that, as I understand it, Emma started working on this amazing book during 2019, and was actually doing a huge amount of the work during the pandemic lockdown period. So it is one of those, and yet another one of these enchanting books that's come from work during that period. And there really is no doubt that Emma's mother, Mary Churchill, had a front row seat to history and to the incredible events that were taking place when she was growing up as a sort of a teenager. And I just wanted to say this book and the talk that Emma's going to give is a charming and insightful view of a young woman living history, and full of those amazing Churchill characteristics. So I thought I might just mention a few of those that include, obviously, bravery, invincibility, determination, and most importantly, optimism. This book really reflects Emma's wonderful mother's sense of charm and enjoyment and empathy for people in all walks of life, and particularly during those extraordinarily turbulent times. I've read the book several times, and I'm going to be reading it again straight after this talk, because it is just a very beautiful book. I think it's true to say that Mary Churchill, as she was at that point, has a great sense of humor, and she really does have such impressive admiration for her parents, especially aware and admiring of her father's vital role in history. She admired her father's speeches, and that's very much a strong theme that comes through the book. And throughout her diaries, you can enjoy her wit and charm that clearly runs in the Churchill and Soames family. And really, with that point on that wonderful charm, intelligence, and wit, that is a moment that I would like to hand over to our absolutely wonderful speaker, Emma Soames, who has an abundance of all these same talents. And we're very delighted, Emma, that you're here with us today.
Vivian, thank you so much. I remember sitting round a boardroom table with you at Condé Nast in the sad, bad days when I edited Tatler, and you used to bring increasingly bad news every month about the plummeting circulation figures of Tatler. And it was only a few months after that that I was fired. Into every life a little rain has fallen. It's lovely to be with you all today. It really is. And I'm thrilled to be able to tell you more about my mother's wartime diaries. It is not an exaggeration to say that my 16-year-old mother showed a Churchillian prescience for great events when she started a diary in January 1939. At first, it only records the thoughts of a rather prim and very naive teenager, discussing the state of her nails and love of her pony. Quote, "I have come to the frightful conclusion that I am A, insincere, B, a coquette, C, I bite my nails, D, I think too much about myself. Reform is needed, and I am determined to try to be more natural and nice." 8th of May, 1939. But in September that year, of course, war is declared, and her father is made First Lord of the Admiralty. She has her 17th birthday at Chartwell, but then moves to London to Admiralty House with her parents and begins to grow up fast before our very eyes. In those first few months of the war, among visits to Portsmouth to inspect the fleet, where she is thrillingly piped aboard a cruiser, which is all written in capital letters, which is what she always resorts to when she's excited. And it can apply as much to being piped aboard a cruiser as to finding a lot of butter on board the Queen Mary. She attends the wedding of her brother Randolph to Pamela Digby, but by far the most notable thing that happens to her, both in 1939 and for the next 3 years, are the visits she pays to the House of Commons to hear her father speak and take part in the wartime debates, such as that about the fall of France or the censure debate in 1942. Her description of her first resentful and then admiring House of Commons, slowly rising to its feet to give her father a standing ovation, is just thrilling. All this, plus hearing him deliver some of the greatest set pieces known in this language of ours. And she heard them live in the House of Commons. And of course, this understandably changes her view of her father. At Chartwell, during the wilderness years, when he was hard at work in his study and she was still in the nursery or looking after her pony, their relationship was, I think, fond but distant. But after hearing him in the house, she writes, "I am enthralled by the magnitude of Papa's brain and personality. I fear I have not appreciated him sufficiently or loved him till just lately. But now my heart has been awakened. I am torn between pride and a deepening love for him." From there on, her life and her diary is shot through with her devotion to her father and her desire to do all she can to support him. At her very first public appearance, to launch war bombs at Westerham, the local village to Churchill, she calmed her nerves by thinking, I could not but feel mighty proud of Papa because it was all for him, and it made me determined to do him credit so that he would never have to make excuses for his daughter. From there on, it was but a short distance to the huge sense of duty that stayed with her all her life. I noticed I used to sometimes go with her to events where she was making a speech or in some way performing. And when it came to the moment where she was having to perform, so to speak, I could see her draw herself up to her full, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual height. And she was channeling this desire to do her father duty. My father once said to me, I can't get your mother to give a dinner party, but wave a flag and she's off. My mother died at 92 in 2014 and left all her papers to the Churchill Archive Centre at Cambridge. This is a family tradition. The centre holds not only my grandfather's papers, but also my grandmother's, all their children's, and my father's. It is also home to Lady Thatcher's archive and many other politicians and figures in the political and military sphere of the last 40 years. It is a powerhouse of primary sources. I became aware of the diaries when Mary was writing her memoir, A Daughter's Tale, and I assumed that she had filleted the best parts because she'd never mentioned them before. But after her death, when the 15 journals, many of them school notebooks and scribbled in pencil, were digitized, it emerged that there was a rich seam of historic and social interest still to be mined. Sorry. My mother made me her literary executor, and my interest was further piqued by how much time I had to spend granting permission or not to historians and other writers wishing to quote from the diaries as primary sources for the first time. It was curious how uncommunicative my mother was about the diaries and indeed her life in the war. As regards the diaries, I rather think that she was embarrassed by some of the sort of Jejeune entries, which she described as hot-making. Or worse still, I was not listening. And she was far from a war bore. She lived very much in the present. But she did not, I'm happy to say, destroy the diaries, nor did she leave any instructions about their use. It was only a couple of years after her death that I came to realize that they hold their own in the crowded field of Churchilliana. They certainly provide a view, a truly intimate view of what was going on in the Churchill family during the war, which is an area pretty much uncovered. I mean, it was, and some of it wasn't all that pretty. I mean, in terms of there were frightful rows about Randolph, but there were also, her mother's health was an issue, but there was also her father's relationship with her and her siblings. And I found it it opened a window for me on an area of our family that I'd never seen before. Indeed, on a more personal level, few people have the possibility of looking their 17-year-old mother in the eye, and I realise I'm deeply privileged to have had this opportunity, particularly since Mary, from the word go, was a truly delightful person. She was brave, funny, dutiful, and always determined to do the right thing. The diary is a coming-of-age account kept under extraordinary circumstances, sometimes at sea, sometimes under canvas, often in bomb shelters, such as at number 10, Chequers, or later on the gun park of the batteries she manned from Whitby to Enfield, but largely in Hyde Park, where she was posted to be near her father. This, of course, being my mother, she was very embarrassed by, but nobody else was, because her father needed her. She doesn't necessarily write an entry every day, but she writes consistently and keeps the diary pretty much right through the war. It's only right at the end where, instead of writing diary entries, she starts writing very long letters, descriptive letters, to her mother, one of which is about a visit to Belsen, which is agonizing to read, as you may imagine. And the other one is about the goings-on, the doing of the flowers and the moving of the chairs at the Potsdam Conference, where she went as my father's ADC. We close the narrative in 1945. She is still with her battery in Germany, but at the request of her mother, she leaves active service to return to be with her parents, who are suffering greatly after what must have been an almost incomprehensibly painful result in the general election. Mary had been largely brought up behind the metaphorical green baize door at Chartwell by the redoubtable Nana, Marriott, or Moppet White, a cousin of Clementine's, who rode to the rescue after the tragic death of their fourth child, Marigold, aged only 3. Shortly after the elder children left home, she ended up with sole charge of Mary. I feel a huge debt to Nana, who imbued Mary with a strong sense of enduring values and a deep, practical Christian faith that stayed with her all her life. She also provided a level of stability that her older siblings sadly did not enjoy. They were overseen by a procession of ineffective French governesses who, from all accounts, that were terrorized by the children. Nana becomes a confidant, and even as Mary grows up, she makes many appearances in the diaries. Around the same time, Mary writes a mission statement of her intention with the journal. I'm not a great or important personage, but it will be the diary of an ordinary person's life in wartime, or rather the life of a girl upon whom life has shone very brightly. Even at 16, there is a tension in her character which comes through strongly in the following years. She has a passionate desire to be an ordinary person and not to be shown any sort of favoritism. But her circumstances were as far as ordinary as it is possible to be. Her first latchkey was to number 10, Downing Street. The first night she spent in America was at the White House. And at 18, she was spending her weekends at Chequers with the cream of the High Command and the American envoys, Gil Wynand, Averell Harriman, and Harry Hopkins. Plus, occasionally, Noel Coward, who would turn up, often unexpectedly, to divert the Prime Minister whenever he'd written a new song. Despite all this, Mary did have a humble side to her, a rather attractive trait that saved her from princessly behaviour, and her greatest ambition was to be treated as an ordinary person. There's a marvellous line, if I can find it, in which she says, I'm determined not to be thought the end. which was sort of what people said in those days when they were, I mean, it was just the end. You know. Her relationship with her father continues to grow, and in 1942 she writes, "I think my love and admiration of Papa is almost a religion to me. I sometimes cannot hold the emotions I have for him." Before my mother joined the ATS, she was agonized about leaving her parents, but curiously, Winston came to love and admire her all the more for signing up. Indeed, he visited her batteries often. In 1941, she tells of journeys she travelled with her father. And there is quite a lot of excited exclamation marks and capital letters when she travels north to Liverpool to christen a new warship, HMS Gurkha. Later, she is with Winston when he visits Swansea and Bristol as the Blitz raged. And her description of the crowd's reaction to coming out of the bomb shelters and finding their Prime Minister, Churchill, driving down the street in front of them is better than Pathé footage. The most transformative moment in her war and in her reaching womanhood is when she joins the ATS in the summer of 42. The Auxiliary Territorial Service was, of course, the women's branch of the army. Founded in 38, it was originally manned by volunteers, but as more men were needed for the front line, so did newly paid roles and the status of women increased within the ATS. My mother got an inside track of this when she heard General Pyle, who was the general in charge of Home Command, seeking her father's approval at Chartwell to use women in anti-aircraft batteries, which was the radical new step. Almost immediately, she and her best friend, Judy Montague, signed up. She'd never really spent any time away from home, and while she's doing basic training, she's battling homesickness, worrying about not being at home to support her parents, as well as desperately trying to fit in. She wants to be a private, and indeed asks her mother not to use envelopes from number 10 Downing Street when she writes to her, because of course they say number 10 and the cipher on the back. But within weeks, her cover is blown as the Ministry of War decide to use her as a poster girl to help increase recruitment. Her small chance of remaining private is over. And how I had hoped that this might not happen, that I really could be a person and not a name, that I might just be a perfectly ordinary private. But if there's anything I can do to help my papa, then I will do it. So what we have behind us now is one of the many pictures taken during a day of full-on photography of my mother doing everything from scrubbing the steps to peeling the potatoes, in the hope, I hope not a vain one, of upping the figures of women joining up. In the course of her ATS career, she was posted to some 14 different battery sites, and she saw action many times, particularly when the doodlebugs started. She was posted 3 times to Hyde Park, where a string of dignitaries, many of them accompanied by her proud father, visited the site. He wrote to Randolph in April 44, "Sometimes I go to Mariah's battery in Hyde Park and hear the child ordering the guns to fire." She became a gunner sergeant before transferring to officer training. She ended the war in Germany after her battery was chosen to be part of the clean-up operation to D-Day. By then she was a junior commander and a captain with 220 girls under her command. And it was from Hamburg that she returned home to civilian life in 1945. Between the lines of this timeline, there are many fascinating events happen in her life. She was part of Churchill's charm offensive at Chequers, and became very pally with Avel Harriman and Gil Wynant, etc. And in fact, at one point she gets engaged very young and very ill-advisedly to a young man called Eric Duncannon. And Clementine gets on board Avel Harriman and Harry Hopkins to dissuade my mother from marrying this man. So one evening after dinner, my mother, in floods of tears, finds herself being frog-marched round the lawn at Chequers by Avel Harriman, who's absolutely sweet. Anyway, they successfully talk her out of marrying this young man. But I love the thought of having the cream of American diplomacy at work on the affaire sentimentale of the Prime Minister's 19-year-old daughter. Later, in 1943, she goes with her parents on a thrilling and not entirely safe transatlantic journey. Mary as her father's ADC. The ship, the Queen Mary, has been done up supposedly to take on board Queen Wilhelmina, who, as my mother points out, has nothing in common with her father other than their figures. Over this 6-week marathon, they travel first to the Quebec Conference and then on to stay with Roosevelt at the White House. The Americans take her to their heart, and among many other things, she encounters her first bottle of Coca-Cola, her first slot machine, and she's flown around the country on glamorous day visits with the cream of the American Air Force. She has to address 2,000 women at the Bendix radio factory, and around this time, she goes into a sort of fit of dissatisfaction about herself. I have to say, not the first or the last. And she thinks that her diary is too much about her and not about, the people around her. So she treats us to an analysis of FDR, who she sat next to several nights at the White House, where he serves what she describes as violent cocktails. I wish I could analyse all I feel and think about FDR, but I'm so intrigued. To me, he seems at once idealistic, cynical, warm-hearted and generous, worldly wise, naive, courageous, tedious, vain, sophisticated. And what a stout-hearted champion he has been for the unfortunate and the battling. Yet while I admire him intensely and could not but be devoted to him after his great personal kindness to me, yet I must confess he makes me laugh and he rather bores me. She never fails to describe the precious moments she spends alone with her father. Never too long, because she's terrified of boring him. And she describes them as the golden peaks of her life. One of these happens the day after she writes this entry about FDR, he's got a cottage up in the Catskills, just above his official home, and he lends it to Winston and Mary for the day. Papa presented a charming sight, flat on his back in a patch of sun. I lay near him and we gazed up at the very blue sky and the green leaves, flecked with sun. He described to me the colours he would use were he painting and commented on the wisdom of God in having made the sky blue and the trees green. It wouldn't have been nearly so good the other way round. In 1944, on another quite extraordinary journey with her parents, she goes to Paris for the celebration of the liberation of France, where Churchill walks down the Champs-Élysées with General de Gaulle. After a vin d'honneur with the cream of the French resistance at the Hôtel de Ville, which incidentally was the Nazi headquarters in Paris, and where Grandpapa was presented with the swastika flag that had flown above it. They went to snowbound eastern France on a train to expect the reconfigured French forces of Maquis, Free French and Foreign Legion, all longing to have a go at the Germans before they surrendered. In the train that will bear them back to Paris, de Gaulle presents Mary with a Croix de Lorraine, the symbol of the Free French, which she wore with pride on Remembrance Days for the rest of her life. It is also worth pointing out that 40 years later, my father was unexpectedly made ambassador to Paris, and Mary ended up sitting next to Le Général again at lunch. It is almost impossible to imagine that Churchill was on his own on the night of VE Day, because I think all his private secretaries and everything had gone home to their families, and Clementine was on a tour of Russia as head of the Aid to Russia Fund. So he was dining alone at number 10 with only Smokey the cat for company. Mary was in Brussels having a right grand old time with her battery on the way to Germany. But she's whistled, put in a tiny plane and flown home. She arrives VE Day +1. She has lunch with her father alone, and then they set off to deliver the letters of surrender to the embassies, so to the American embassy, the French and the Russian embassies. The description my mother writes of driving through the crowds in London is amazing, I have to say. But you know, the crowds were so polite that it only took 4 outriders to protect an open car with the Prime Minister and his daughter in it. But woven into this narrative, should we go on one, thanks? This narrative of great events, the presiding genius of her father and the long shadow of war, is the story of a teenager who is becoming a woman. So the thoughts and feelings of a high-spirited daughter turning from a very innocent ingénue to an eligible and increasingly sophisticated young woman with 3 years of army experience. In 1939, she makes her debut at Queen Charlotte's Ball, just down the road at the Dorchester, I think, in an evening which was made for her when her very overworked father made time to come and join their table at Queen Charlotte's. And in another account of that evening, apparently the entire ballroom got to their feet when he arrived. And then she goes back to Queen Charlotte's the following year, where she takes a very blasé, world-weary view of some of the Debs that year, saying, oh, not a very good crop, you know. She being the princely age of 18 by now. But it was that very night, or the night before, that a direct hit fell on the Café de Paris. So while they were all dancing the night away in the Dorchester ballroom, many of their contemporaries were lying under the rubble of the Café de Paris, and my mother felt bad about it. I mean, she never really hardly talked about the war to me, but she did often mention how incredibly guilty she felt that they went on dancing and they didn't go home. I have to say, I have never known a social life like it. Every single night when my mother was with her girls, there was a dance in camp every night, and on leave, the social life was hysterical. I mean, there were parties in hotels, parties in private houses, nightclubs, visits to the theatre, I mean, and on and on. As well as Eric Duncannon, my mother has sort of one or two more flirtations, one of which was with an obviously very good-looking man called American soldier called Ed Conklin. But he is soon dispatched, having been exposed to the full glare of Chequers. And there is something I came to know as the Chequers effect. You know, young men who were a dream on the dance floor, or a dream in the mess, whirling dervishes on the dance floor, somehow shriveled to a less than godlike size when taken home to Chequers and exposed to a very kindly Winston, and suddenly Mary couldn't get rid of them fast enough. She is occasionally riddled with insecurities. Can you put the next one? Thank you. Sometimes about her faith, but more often about her appearance. I mean, it's quite often she talks about her size, her fingernails, I mean, on it goes. Looking at, they were having dinner with Max Beaverbrook, looking at Kathy Harriman, slim, competent, sophisticated, and exquisitely dressed, and at Pamela, by now Churchill, voluptuous and furred, and Sarah Churchill, romantic and strange-looking. I then looked at myself and felt miserable. I looked so aggressively healthy. I'm fat, my hands aren't pretty and might be kept better kept, and suddenly all my battery life, which for the last 4 months has been so sufficient for the day, and in which I have been so extra enthralled just lately, suddenly it seemed so terribly unimportant. I felt a clod and girl-guided. And there are many entries along those lines. She could also be very funny. I'll read you one thing. When they're on their way to Europe. Sorry. Oh, here we are. She's getting on board at Ostend. She's getting on board the troop carrier to take them to mainland Europe. But they have to wait to let incoming prisoners of war get off the ship. I could not resist, as I passed, giving them a look of what I intended them to interpret as triumphant loathing. But I fear, and how just, it probably made me look a discontented, served-up, fat ATS officer, comparing on the whole unfavourably with Hitler's Rhine maidens. And there's another bit that's very, very funny. Oh, I don't think I'm going to be able to find it. I have to say, and the other thing is, she had a terrifically romantic side to her. Her favourite film was Gone with the Wind, and she longed to wear a crinoline and have lots of beaux, as she called them. But on the whole, she was going out from camp, watching Gone with the Wind, going home, eating fish and chips and going to bed. I've actually acquired late onset admiration of my mother's military career. In the 3 years, she was promoted from private Churchill to captain and served in mixed anti-aircraft batteries across a dozen sites in England and then in Europe. She ended up as a junior commander with 200 girls under her command. Although she never discussed it in later life, she was proud of her time in the military, and as what she achieved, she regarded as very much her own making. So when she has to take off her gunner sergeant colours, she says she really doesn't want to take them off because they were hers of her own making. She has a terrific sense of occasion, and what we have on a happy juxtaposition of image and text. When she and her parents were coming home from America, they came back on HMS Renown. And it's just it makes my spine tingle. Misty and wettish, sailing up the Clyde, we dropped anchor opposite Greenock at about 9:30. All hands on the quarterdeck. Papa spoke to the company, then off caps, and we sang Eternal Father Strong to Save, and then we gave thanks for our safe arrival. It was lovely, warm in the sun, coming thinly through the mist, and ships passing by in this great landlocked bay. And then standing beneath those tremendous guns, we sang Onward Christian Soldiers and God Save the King. And then we left, and 3 cheers for Papa, and the decks crowded with the ship's company, waving and cheering. And so we left HMS Renown. May God bless her and all who sail in her. And then I think I'll just end with her description of a family party for her father's 70th birthday, which is 1944. They are at number 10 Downing Street. I won't go through the list of who was there because, well, it was all family except for Brendan Bracken and Max Beaverbrook. When we were all assembled, the candles were lit on the cake, 70 of them. Papa looked so pleased and well. At dinner, Diana and Sarah sat on either side of Papa. Dinner was delicious and ended with peaches, birthday cake, and real cream, a present. All Papa's presents were loaded on a table, and there was a magnificent bottlescape. Max proposed Papa's health, not very well, but Papa's reply made me weep. He said we were the dearest there are. He said he had been comforted and supported by our love. It was short, but I couldn't see the faces at the end. And then, very slowly, almost solemnly, he clinked glasses with each one of us. Thank you.
Emma, I'm just going to sit with you for a moment as whilst we start the questions, that I think people will be very keen to put a few questions to you. But just to say that simply is the most beautiful description of these just, incredible years where your mother played, such a big role alongside her family and really had this front seat to history. I would just like to remind everyone that we are, Emma is very kindly doing some book signing, and we'll have some books afterwards that will be just as you go through the doorway on the right. And I can highly recommend this absolutely wonderful book. But I wanted to sort of start just asking Emma a question that occurred to me that you might touch on quickly, and that was your mother received an MBE, I think, a military MBE, just in the wartime, after the wartime period, and then she had many incredible roles that she continued doing in her sort of adult life, effectively. And obviously another wonderful award that honour that she certainly had was the being made the Companion of the Order of the Garter.
Yes.
That I thought was just so very special, such a recognition of the incredible role that she has had. And it struck me also that obviously your mother was very much a contemporary of Her Majesty the Queen.
Absolutely.
During these extraordinary years, or the many, many years. And I was wondering whether there were some sort of thoughts you might touch on.
Yes, they did meet, but only once, rather surprisingly, because I think Her Majesty was in the ATS as well. She drove a heavy-duty truck, but I think she probably was too precious to be allowed near a gun battery. But on Thanksgiving Day, one year, I can't remember which, the King and the Queen give a party for visiting American soldiers at Buckingham Palace. My mother is so excited to be going to Buckingham Palace, has a wonderful time, and there are the two princesses. But she doesn't go into, that's the only time in the diaries that she records meeting them. But in later life, she didn't become a close friend of the Queen, but she certainly knew her. And I do remember the Queen staying with some friends who lived quite near to us, and the Queen came to tea with us, and my mother, I thought, went mad and went and bought a new tea set.
That's really wonderful. Yeah, I couldn't resist that question. I think we might have all been thinking of that. I think also your mother had this incredible role where she was aide-de-camp to your father and went to Potsdam at such a very historic moment, obviously again with the world leaders at that time. I wonder whether you touch on that.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm sorry, I perhaps should have done this in my talk, but there's so much in the book, it's difficult to do everything. She did indeed go with her father, but ADCs were definitely, hadn't sort of signed the Official Secrets Act, so to speak. So she was not there on government business. She was there to make her father's life nicer, do anything she could to help him, arrange the flowers, move the table, but also she does rather worryingly portray, she calls Stalin Uncle Joe. So he was obviously putting his best foot forward. After dinner, my grandfather invites my mother to come and sit behind him at the end of the banquet. And there's a lot of, obviously, toasts, but then Stalin becomes like an autograph hunter, and he goes right round the table asking everybody for their autographs. And then, of course, what happens is that my father and Mary have to leave early to go back because of the result of the 1945 election. And it's all sort of, oh, see you in a couple of days' time sort of thing. I don't think anybody was particularly worried about it. And then, of course, they never went back, and the Labour government picked up the
yeah, that's wonderful. I just want the other slide actually on the one before. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, just that one. Thank you very much. I also, if you don't mind, just wanted to read this tiny few lines, just because I thought they were just really did show the wonderful character of your mother in the diaries. And I just thought, I don't think you've touched on this one, but I know you touched on the fact that she she had such admiration for her parents and for her father, and really wanted to do all the right things in her role as daughter and in her many other roles. But I love this little excerpt, which is in her diaries. In the afternoon, I went down to the House of Commons. Chamberlain spoke calmly, clearly, and comprehensively. Papa arose amidst good applause and made a wonderful speech. He has such a gift of language and declamation. He pulled us all together. He cheered us up. He strengthened our courage and resolution. And I just thought that is a really lovely sort of, mention in the diaries that we can all very much kind of relate to. So we would love to open it up to questions. We have two microphones that are available to go around to everyone, and we have a few minutes for questions if you would like to put those to Emma.
The question is why she never spoke openly about the diary. She kept it sort of not hidden, but
I just don't know, is the honest answer to that. I talked to her, she had a secretary called Noni Chapman who was with her for many, many years and who incidentally had been my grandmother's secretary too, many years before that. And she, until my mother was writing A Daughter's Tale, she didn't really know about them either. I mean, she'd seen them on the shelf, but she didn't know what they were. And my mother, I think my mother felt pretty ambivalent about the diaries in a way, because she realized that they were important, but equally, she does say some pretty silly things in them, I have to say. She wasn't 16 for nothing. Thank you.
So the question I have is, your mother obviously had some important roles and quite challenging times. So what aspect of her personality do you think helped her, succeed and kind of endure over the many challenges she faced?
A strong sense of duty, and although she was always very worried by not having it, she had great courage, my mother. She was very gutsy and very resilient, but I think in a way that whole generation was much more resilient than we are, and even if you were the Prime Minister's daughter, life could be quite tough.
Did she touch in her diaries upon the relationship to her mother?
Yes, absolutely. She is devoted to her mother. I mean, I saw this later on because my grandmother lived on a decade after my grandfather died, and she was always devoted to her mother. But somehow the thing that the diaries focus on is her relationship with her father and her love and admiration for him, and the sort of excitement of watching the war happen under his watch. But yes, there are lots and lots of mentions of my grandmother in there, who did an amazing job running two houses, on what's the word? But they had tokens. They didn't have enough food. And then she was running the Aid to Russia campaign, so they were entertaining a lot. But my grandmother did have, sort of down. She did get very depressed at moments. And I mean, for instance, when they all went to America, my mother went with them to America for the Quebec conference. My grandmother took to her bed quite a lot, and my mother had to deputise for her. So she was slightly up and down, and my mother does talk about it. And I just think it's a terrible pity that my grandmother lived when she lived, because now there is so much more help for depression, that she probably could have had a much smoother path through life. But she was a wonderful, wonderful, stylish, clever woman, my grandmother. I loved her.
Just to say that I think there'll be there's one more question, yes. And then there'll be opportunity also during book signing if you'd like to speak that.
What would your mother have thought of her former sister-in-law, Pamela Digby, becoming the American ambassador to France?
Well, I went with my mother to visit Pam when she was in Paris, but my mother, she's very good in the book on Pamela, because she's one of the few people that doesn't sort of quite buy into the Pamela story as many others have. And she finds Pam frightfully annoying, actually, and patronising. But anyway, there is a lot about Pamela, and of course the frightful ructions with Randolph in the diaries.
Yes. How did she actually meet her husband?
Right. Well, in the year after the war, in 1946, she went with her father to these wonderful visits of European countries who wanted to say thank you, and gave them the most fantastic time. I've written a lot of it actually in the epilogue. It's one of my favourite bits, actually. But anyway, it turned out that the Queen of Belgium was conniving to get her rather hopeless son, King Charles, the regent, Prince Charles, to marry Mary. And I think neither of them were very keen on this idea. Anyway, the day in Brussels, the last day of their visit, the press, the English and the Belgian press, came out with this thing, Mary Churchill to marry Prince Charles. I mean, they were both appalled and had to sit next to each other at lunch. It was very embarrassing. So then, from there, Winston and my mother go to Paris. And there, in the embassy, 2 days after the Prince Charles debut, she meets the assistant military attaché, Christopher Soames. So, 1946.
That's really wonderful. And as we know from the diaries, one of her most favourite cities.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just really, we want to sort of thank Emma so much for joining us today and talking to KCWC members about this wonderful book and about her family. We're so grateful and so delighted and honoured that you're able to join us today. So thank you. We have a thank you, and I'm going to let the president of KCWC come up and I'll bring that up.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your fascinating talk, and what a wonderful way to celebrate your mother's life. Thank you. And as a token of gratitude, I would like to present you with an honorary membership of our club.
Oh.
I'd like to take this opportunity to announce our upcoming events. On the 8th of December, we've got Christmas cocktail party with drinks, canapes. Sorry. Yeah, so this is our Christmas cocktail party at University Women's Club, which will be on the 8th of December. So we'll have drinks, canapes, choir, and raffle prizes. Our board secretary, Mimi, will be singing in the choir, so please come and support her. Very welcome to bring your partners. And, sorry, I think I'm missing some slides, actually. So I would also like to mention for after 6, we'll have a festive dinner with their own DJ and dance floor at Mario's restaurant in Gloucester Road. The cost is £48 for both guests and members. You'll have 2-course dinner, 2 glasses of wine, their own DJ and dancing on their own dedicated dance floor. Please contact Gilly Ferraro for this event. Also, I'd like to announce about our charity. Volunteers for Charity is raising funds to support the work of One Westminster. At the last general meeting, it was announced that we would be asking for cash donations to purchase gift bags for the Befriending Plus project, which works with the elderly. We have since learned that the Befriending project has come to an end, and so we'll be supporting One Westminster's Learning Disabilities volunteering scheme, which helps people with a learning disability gain a volunteer role to help build their confidence and gain new skills. Our activity leader liaison, Kathleen Crook, will be by the door. We'll be expecting a minimum cash donation of £20. If you're not prepared today, you will have an opportunity to make donation on the 8th of December. Also, please do not miss our next general meeting, which is on the 12th of January next year. 3 amazing women succeeding in music, criminal law, fashion against all odds, in conversation with Professor Eve Middleton-Kelly, who is in charge of our programs. So our guest speakers are Chichi Wanako, CBE, professor at Royal Academy of Music and founder of Chineke Orchestra, which is a British orchestra. In fact, the first professional orchestra in Europe to be made up of majority Black and ethnically diverse musicians. And then we'll have Dr. Maggie Sample, founder of Sample, brand of luxury bespoke women's wear, and honorary bencher in Middle Temple. We'll also have Nicola Williams, one of the 100 most influential Black people in the UK. She's a renowned criminal law barrister and an author. So I hope you'll be coming to this event. This event will be taking place in Roswell again. This is a private members club, so I will request you to pre-register on our website. One of our members has a spare ticket for our lunch today. If you're joining the lunch, please, what's her name? Eve. She was sitting next to you. Yes. So yeah, please ask Eve if you want a ticket to our lunch later on at the Avenue. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you at the Christmas cocktail party, which will be 8th of December. It's a beautiful venue. So please bring your partners, and that's it. All right. Thank you very much.